Hi, my name is James Payne. Just to say thank you, first of all, for turning out. And thank you to the BIC for being so welcoming. It's been a joy working with these people, really has. Um, I would say Bengaluru is probably my favorite city in India now at the moment. The last time I was here was 28 years ago. So it's slightly different. so, just one thing before I start is that I have had a bit of a cough, so you're going to have to forgive me, or as they say over here, adjust Madi. So, uh, I'm going to talk about my journey, my weird journey, my very strange journey to YouTube and how I became an overnight sensation, really. So I wake up every day, even now, 5 years later, going, what happened? So this is what it's like. I'm going to be reading some excerpts as well from my book. And this is my introduction, but I do believe, I think I spent more time, the book was very difficult for me. Really, I come from a non, a non-intellectual background. I left school at 16 with no qualifications, and I just bummed around Europe for a very, very long time. France, Italy, learning languages, and I'll talk to you about what happened after that. And so I spent a long time working on this introduction, and I'd say my very first words are really important for me, which is knowing what we know about Van Gogh's life doesn't make Starry Night a better painting, but it does make it more interesting. That's my opinion. Okay, so I spend my whole time on YouTube in my book saying it's not the correct answer, it's my opinion as well. I think knowing what we know about Van Gogh makes it more interesting. That's my opinion. I'm going to read the next. So I'm not used to standing still so much. I'm a bit of a fidget ass, as we say in the UK. So I'm going to read an excerpt from my book. As we go, I'm going to read about 4 or 5 excerpts, and this is from the end of the introduction, which, as I say, was really important to me. One of the guiding principles of Great Art Explained has always been accessibility. Art history should not be the exclusive domain of scholars and critics. I've written this book for those who have ever stood before a painting or sculpture and felt a deep emotional connection, an inexplicable pull. I've written it for the curious, the skeptics, and the dreamers. I've written it for anyone who has ever wanted to see beyond the surface and understand the layers and meaning that art can offer. So this is my channel, Great Art Explained, and I'm going to talk to you briefly about how I did become a YouTuber. I was not really even that interested in YouTube before. I watched it a few times, and this was my job for 25 years. I was a tour guide. So I was a tour guide taking Americans and Canadians around the world. So I used to have up to 52 people following behind me, asking lots of questions. And I took them to Paris, I took them to London, I took them to Rome. And I do think a lot of my life has been very accidental. I love this job, by the way. I loved working with North Americans. I love taking them to sites because North Americans, when they see the Eiffel Tower, they go, ah! When Brits see the Eiffel Tower, they go, oh, yeah, Eiffel Tower. And I love the enthusiasm of North Americans. And I found that over here as well in many of the galleries that I've been to. So I spent my whole life talking to these people. And, I really could talk about the Mona Lisa for 2 hours easily. I could spend the whole 2 hours here, whatever, talking about the Mona Lisa. But I realized that people's eyes start glazing over after a while, and they're not as interested as I am, which I never understand that, So I realized that 10 to 15 minutes was enough. That was enough information. I could get a lot of information about the Mona Lisa, about the Renaissance out within 15 minutes. And my videos, have you seen my videos at all? They're very action-packed, so there's a lot of information in them, but they don't feel rushed. Okay, they're calming, which is what I wanted. So I learned how to say what I wanted to say in 15 minutes without that boy on the right-hand side falling asleep. Then when I was 30, in my mid-30s, I decided you know what? I left school at 16, and at the time we had free education in the UK, not anymore. And I thought, I want my free education that I've paid my taxes for, you know. So I decided to go to college to become an artist at Central St Martin's, which is the most famous art school. And because I was a mature student, or I thought I was, it meant that I could go for free. It also meant that I could get in without qualifications. So I went to Central St Martin's, wanted to become an artist. I spent 5 years at art school, getting a degree and then a higher degree. And I must say, within 3 years, I realized I was the worst artist in the whole school. So, and I realized I didn't want to be an artist. I didn't even like being an artist at all, but I loved organizing people. So I had a show within 2 years. I organized a show with 130 artists in London, including some from India. And I realized I was good at it. So I realized I could work with artists rather than be an artist myself. So I gave up being an artist and became a curator. While I was at school, I was learning all these classic texts like Deleuze, you know, Roland Barthes. Even if I hear the name Baudrillard now, I shiver. You know, I just learned all this word and I understand it because I did 5 years of it. I understand the language, but that's not what I'm interested in now. This is something we call international art English. I'm afraid you suffer from this in India as well, as I've noticed going around galleries, with this very obtuse language, very difficult language. International art English was supposedly invented in England because we love making language inaccessible. So I'm going to read this very, very quickly. In this new body of work, the artist interrogates the liminal tensions between presence and absence, destabilizing entrenched hierarchies of seeing. By activating the viewer's embodied subjectivity, the installation proposes a radical rethinking of spatial politics. This was a gallery in London a month ago. This is not made up. Okay, and this is when I can read that and understand it after a while. You know, when I was in the museum in Mumbai 2 weeks ago, I was reading the text on the wall and I was thinking, this is difficult to read, you know? So I wanted to open that up. I've always wanted to open that up. Then I started a gallery in East London called Payne. I loved having a gallery because I love working with artists who are the most difficult people in the world. Yes, the most difficult people in the world for sure. And I love working with them. I love the relationship. And I had this gallery, and one of the first things I used to do when we had an art show, we had an artist come in, I'd say, write your press release for me. And I'd read their press release, and it was full of all this gobbledygook language, which I studied at art school. And I'd say, no, go away, rewrite this, starting with, there are 35 paintings in this show. Just be clear, be simple, explain to people what it's about. And be direct, because that's what I've always been my whole life, is direct, sometimes to my detriment. So what I was doing just before lockdown was this. I was a guide for very wealthy people in UK private galleries. So I did this. And when I say wealthy people, I'm talking about I would take 20 women, usually women who were whose husbands funded the galleries. And as we came out of the gallery to go to the next gallery, there was lined up limousines to take them maybe 50 yards up the road. So it was super enjoyable because I'm English and I can be quite rude. And so they're used to it, you know. So I actually enjoyed that job. And then, of course, this happened. And this is lockdown. Lockdown happened. London closed. And of course, my main income was tourism. And that job died. That job completely died for me, and I was freelance. You know, I was at the point in my life when I had enough money, I could last out lockdown, which I thought would last for 2 or 3 weeks. And then a year or so later, I'm thinking, what do I do now? Hey, I'm going to start a YouTube channel. Never even thought about it before in my life. I just woke up one morning, I'm going to start a YouTube channel. And I started this channel, which is Great Art Explained in 15 minutes. And with the aim of what I've always been doing, which is trying to explain art very clearly. You know, the funny thing about me is that my book, it has chapters on mental health. It has chapters on gender politics. It has chapters on race. It has chapters on class. but I deal with it in a very different way. I deal with it as storytelling. And I feel like I'm very direct when I deal with these things. And so I'm not dealing with simple things. I'm dealing with extremely complicated things, but I'm taking away some of the language. That's all I'm doing. So this is what I did here. I started this channel. Then I started another channel called Great Books Explained. So of course, this is James Joyce here in this picture, and this is Ulysses. And I must admit, I wake up every day, as I said, surprised the fact that some of my videos have 7 million views. There's 7 million people out there. Oh, by the way, before I forget, my most popular audiences are North Americans, around 64%. My second most popular audience are Indians. So India is my second biggest audience, followed by the Brits, who are always a bit casual about this stuff. So this is James Joyce. Believe it or not, do people know the book Ulysses? We call it the most unread book in history because everyone buys it, but nobody actually reads it because it's unreadable. But I met this wonderful 23-year-old scholar, and we wrote the script together, and that video now has had 1.4 million views for a very complicated, difficult book. So that's what I'm doing. I'm making these things accessible. This is my channel now. I have nearly, with both channels, I have over 2 million subscribers. These are the important things I'm interested in. First of all, language. I think language is a barrier for a lot of people. I come from a very working class background. My father's a truck driver. My mother was a cleaner. And I do know that galleries were very intimidating for my family. Never for me. I was never intimidated from a child onwards. But, language can put people off. And I think, we can open up that language to make it accessible for everyone. Storytelling, I believe we're all storytellers. If you sit with your friends and your family, everyone's a storyteller, and you can make this art more accessible with storytelling. It's okay to have an opinion. I'm going to say that again. It's okay to have an opinion. We're terrified of having opinions, And I tell people, I'm not correct always. Don't patronize. I have this on my desk. Don't patronize. Don't dumb down, and don't assume. Let's say, for example, I know what I'm talking about. I know what chiaroscuro is. I know what the technique of chiaroscuro is, but not everyone does. So I explain what that means. I explain what chiaroscuro is. My work is not anti-intellectualism. It's anti-exclusion. That's the other thing I have by my desk. These are my people I'm interested in. I've always had these people in my mind, always from the beginning. When I started this YouTube channel, I assumed my friends, their friends, my family, their friends would watch my videos and I'd have 100, 200 views. I had no idea that it would explode in such a way. But even from the beginning, even before I thought it might be a success, I thought about these two people. One is this man on the left-hand side, who is me, who is you, who is anyone who knows about art, who understands about art, and understands what chiaroscuro is. I'm aiming at him. I'm aiming at curators. The other is a 15-year-old kid from Wisconsin, okay, or Mysore. A kid who doesn't have access so much to museums that we can open up their lives as well. And I think that's what I've succeeded at. If there's one thing I've succeeded at is appealing to both those types of people. And that's what I think about all the time. I have them in my head when I write my scripts. The way I look at work, there's lots of different ways I look at work. Let's say, for example, the one on the left-hand side. Now, if you go to the museum in Vienna, they have this painting on the wall. And then, I find it hard not, sorry. And then by the side of that, there's a room with another painting, a copy of this painting. And that's where couples have their picture taken. So they have their picture taken with selfies, and it's where men often propose to their wives. My suggestion is, this is nothing to do with romance. This is my suggestion. My suggestion is they're friends. So Gustav Klimt slept with every woman he ever met, basically. So he was a philanderer. He had no romance in him at all. He had 8 children by different women. And there was one woman he was in love with called Emily Flöger. And Emily Flöger was a radical, radical woman. And I believe that's her in the painting. And my suggestion is, this is unrequited love. which doesn't really appeal to someone wanting to propose to their partner. So, but anyway, so my point is there are lots of ways of looking at things. Claude Monet, we sometimes think of him as a chocolate box artist. By that I mean images you see on, do you say that term over here? Images you see on chocolate boxes, beautiful flowers and things like that. But in fact, he was so radical. I'm going to talk about him more. And my suggestion is that some of these later paintings between 1900 and 1926 were about war. He was very much involved in the First World War. Look at this painting here. And this is Nighthawks by Edward Hopper. This painting was done during World War II. This painting was done before America entered World War II. However, there had been two air raids in New York, two practice air raids in New York and one practice air raid in Los Angeles. So they knew war was coming. They had these practices. And this is, some people see this as a painting about loneliness. Some people see this as a painting which is very, very comforting. We're going to do a test. How many of you see this painting as a painting about loneliness? Show of hands. And how many of you see this as a painting which is comforting? And how many of you see it as a mix of both? So it's pretty much 50-50. I'm not making any point here. All I'm thinking is that we've all got different opinions of what painting means because we bring our own personality to it. And that's what my whole ethos is with my channel. So really, what is this about? We can make our own minds up as well. All I do is, my aim is to give you the tools, for example, the technique, the story of the artist, the story of how this painting came about, give you the technique, those tools to go on and do your own research and your own thinking. I'm not telling anyone ever how to think. My channel is called Great Art Explained. One thing I never do is actually explain art. Why did I choose that title? Because everyone got annoyed when I told them about it. And I thought, yeah, let's go with it. So we're going to talk about some art as well. And these are, as you probably know, these are in the center of India. This is Madhya Pradesh. And I'm obsessed with cave art. And these are from 10,000 BCE. And I just really want to talk about cave art and how it works, because you've got roughly about the same time. This is in Australia. This is also in Argentina. Sorry, you're also getting these in Spain. I saw some great caves in Spain recently. Now, the interesting thing about this is people wanting to make their mark. They want to show art. These caves, most of these caves, to get to them, you have to go underground. You have to crawl underneath, get to a very dark space. Remember, no lights. They're holding these burning pieces of fat to do this light, and they're painting here. And they're showing their story. They're telling their story just through art. And no one is necessarily seeing it. Why didn't they do it just outside where the caves are? Why are they way deep inside? Because they wanted a space to show their art. These, by the way, they do this with a reed, and they get ore, colors, and they spray on their hands like that. So that's how they make them. And this is all what art is about, is making your mark and finding your space to make your mark. This is what Alberto Giacometti is doing. This is his brother, Diego Seated, one of my favorite artists. He's doing the same thing as those cave artists are doing in India, 10,000 BCE. Look at these balls here, 16,000 to 14,000 BCE. Look at Picasso. Picasso is the man who said all artists borrow, but great artists steal. And he did. Now I'm going to talk about some specific works of art as well. So this is the Arnolfini portrait. I think this is in my top 3 paintings of all time, which is why I wanted to talk about it. When I was a kid growing up, we called this the Arnolfini marriage. Because it looks like a marriage. I do understand that he looks like Putin as well. So if I hear that one more time, I'll scream. But this painting is interesting because it's, this is why I love history so much. This painting is at a time, this is from Bruges. It's from Bruges, when the middle classes were growing. This huge middle classes, these nouveau riche people. And these two are Italians. So this is Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife Costanza. And he was a merchant, and the merchant classes were growing. This is a new thing. And we see this all again and again throughout the world, of these new classes coming and people stamping on them, telling them what to do. So they were told what they were allowed to do and what they weren't allowed to do. They had things called sumptuary laws, and sumptuary laws were governed by the kings and queens, told people how much luxury they were allowed to have, these nouveau riche people. So is she pregnant, do you think? I would say so, right? But she's not. So this is by Jan van Eyck, the great master. By the way, folks, this is happening the same time as, the Renaissance is just about to happen. He is known as the first oil painter. He's not really, but he was one of the men who perfected it. This is his Eve. So that's his Eve from the Ghent altarpiece, which is one of the most beautiful works of art in the world. And Eve looks pregnant in this painting. Guys, Eve is not pregnant. So in this painting, this is before. So it was a way of showing that women had fecundity, so they were able to give birth. Now, the most interesting thing about this painting, is it was painted in 1434. Costanza died in 1432. So she was dead by the time this was painted. We know that now for a fact. We know that he never married again. But everything in this painting is about showing off. First of all, the most important thing, Jan van Eyck was incredibly famous. To have a painting by Jan van Eyck on your wall in your house was pretty much like having a Porsche parked outside your house today. So it was a way of showing off. The other way of showing off is the clothes they're wearing. To get that green would have taken about 18 to 19 processes to get that deep color, because you're using plants to dye fabric. To get that black, as dark as that, his hat is straw, by the way. To get his clothes as dark as that was also many, many processes. Look at the lining of her fur, the fur lining. That comes from the white fur. This comes from the white fur of squirrels, the belly fur of squirrels. 2,000 of them. 2,000 squirrels died in the making of that dress. So this is a lot of money. They're showing off. Look on the windowsill to his left-hand side. You see oranges. Very expensive to import oranges to Bruges in this period of history. Look at that mirror. Mirrors were very expensive. In fact, that mirror is a lie, because at the time, the biggest mirrors they could produce were around this size. They couldn't produce mirrors that size. So that means Jan van Eyck has made a choice to make that bigger, to make it more central. And I'm going to show you why. And also, it almost looks like the eye of God looking over them. So how do we know she's dead? This is all my suggestions as well, which are in my book. First of all, on the mirror itself. On her side, on the right-hand side of the picture, it starts with the crucifixion at the top. And then it's the deposition, which is Christ being taken. Then it's Christ being laid in the tomb. Keeps going down to the resurrection. So really, the 5 roundels on her side are about death. They're all Christ's death. The 5 roundels on his side, starting from the Last Supper, are all about life. So that's reflecting the way they're standing in the picture. In the mirror is a reflection of them. There's a rumor that they're not holding hands, but we can't be sure about that. Who are the people in the painting welcoming them in? Because interestingly, that room looks like a bedroom because it's got a big bed in it. It's 100% not a bedroom. They would not be welcoming people into their bedroom. It was standard in the 15th century in Bruges and other places that you would have this huge, luxurious bed in your welcoming area that no one ever slept in. It was just to say, I can afford a bed and I can just have it here sitting around when I want it. Most people, 99% of people in the world at this point, had next to no furniture in their bedrooms, in their rooms. Look at that room. It's packed with furniture. It's all about showing off what we've got. So there you've got the mirror on that side. Now, folks, I would like you to look at your small fingernail. You look at your small fingernail. Those roundels are half the size of your small fingernail. They are tiny, really small. Imagine painting that. Look at that crucifixion, which I've blown up there on the right-hand side. That's done with one single hairbrush, with a paintbrush with one hair. It's so small, it's tiny. It's a masterpiece. The whole painting is this big. The details are extraordinary. And oil paint, a new thing. Oh, sorry, I just want to go back to... If we look on just to the left of that mirror, by the way, those are rosary beads. The funny thing is, which I love about this painting, is 80% of the products in that room are things which he imported. So he's really like an advert for his business. So those rosary beads, if you look at the cord holding the rosary beads together, again, that's one single hairbrush that he uses to paint that. Look at the reflection in them. Every single one reflects the room. Look at the candelabra above them. On his side, there's one lit candle. On her side, you can see that candle at the top is snuffed out. You can see the slight bit of wax at the top. That's on her side. So everything represents death on her side and life on his side. All of these are just ways of looking at painting. That text there says, Jan van Eyck was here. So he's signing. It was unusual for people to, even the Renaissance artists didn't sign their paintings. So everything on her side. And then I think the killer for me is that at her feet there's the little dog. And it was very common in medieval tombs for women at that time to have dogs at their feet. It showed fidelity, but I think that's the thing that really adds the last moment to it. And this is Jan van Eyck, my chapter, A Love That Transcends Death. And I'd like to read a second extract. The true mystery of this painting lies in its unparalleled use of space, depth, color, and texture, creating the illusion that we could walk through the flat wooden panel of the painting into a mirrored universe. Jan van Eyck's contemporaries dubbed him an alchemist, but while he may not have invented oil painting as early historians suggested, he undeniably refined the medium. Understanding that some pigments become almost transparent when mixed with oil, he applied numerous thin layers, almost a wash, which gave the work a luminous quality and a finish so smooth that it suggests the Arnolfini portrait has been untouched by human hands. Everything in art is a message. That's a message as well, that people would have looked at that painting, not even seen a brushstroke. I've seen that painting probably more than the Mona Lisa even. And what we do know through science is that in some parts of that, particularly around her green dress, which would have weighed so much as well, around that green dress, is that, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. So, I've lost my train of thought, sorry. Anyway, so around that green dress, we know, oh yeah, sorry, here we go. There are 26 layers of paint that he used. So thin washes. He used it so thin that by the end of it, you can't see any markings on there. So 27 layers. By the way, the Mona Lisa, one part of the Mona Lisa has 38 layers of paint, a thin wash again. So they're just miraculous paintings. I want to look at a more modern artist, which is Francis Bacon, one of my heroes. And this is the one that I look at in the book. So this painting is called Three Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. The most important word in that sentence, in that title, is a. It's not the crucifixion, it's a crucifixion. And that's a really important distinction because there was more than one crucifixion in history. And this is what Francis Bacon's looking at. Now, you would have thought Francis Bacon comes from a Catholic background. He was an atheist by the time he's a painter. And this is his triptych. Now, we have a tradition in Europe of triptychs, And these were taken, if you look at this one at the bottom, these were the two outer leaves folded in, and you would carry it around with you. Or sometimes if it was something like the Ghent altarpiece, which was enormous, the two panels would close and it would only be opened up for special people, for exclusive people. So you would think, wouldn't you, that Francis Bacon based a painting about a crucifixion on one of these triptychs. But in fact, he didn't at all. He based it on this, which is a famous film. He was obsessed with cinema. And this is how I like to look at things in a different way. Jan van Eyck, he had to work with other artists and other impressions. And he had to work with other influences. Francis Bacon was very influenced by cinema. So we think we're looking at religious art. Francis Bacon didn't intend it as religious art at all. And he based this on this film, which is by Abel Gance, which is a silent film by on Napoleon from 1929. And this film splits into 3 screens at the end. So it's interesting how artists can base their work on other mediums. I'd like to ask you, what do you think these 8 figures are doing? Screaming? I think that's the most obvious one, right? Screaming. We think they're screaming. Huh? Yeah. So many different ways of looking at this. I'm really interested in something else, which is another area of Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon, during the Second World War, that's him on, you can see the A pointing towards him, looking very unhappy. But he was a volunteer Air Force warden. So after all the bombings in London, he would go around picking up the bodies. He would pick up those bodies. That's what he's seeing, limbless bodies. And he was also extremely asthmatic. So he had very, very bad asthma. And the dust from the World War II meant that quite often he was hospitalized and he had to give up his job. So quite often he was struggling for hours. Remember, this is the 1940s, as an asthmatic. And is he gasping for breath? Are these figures gasping for breath? This is something I suggest. Are they screaming or are they gasping for breath? And we can look at it both ways. This is another one that he based it on, and this is Sergei Eisenstein's film, A Battleship Potemkin from the 1930s. And he used these images. He also lied. He lied a lot. He lied about 2 things. One was, I don't do preparatory drawings. That's not true at all. The other thing was, I don't use photographs. He pretty much only used photographs. So, but he come from an era where as a homosexual, he had to hide himself, so he had to hide what he was. The interesting thing about him, I find, is that he was an interior designer. So he come from that background as an interior designer. He never told anybody. We didn't find out until he died that he was a very famous interior designer. He was too embarrassed. He thought that's not art, so he had to hide himself quite a lot. These are images we found. This is from my book again. These are images we found where he would use photographs and he would rip them up. And he would use that as his sketchbook, a way of ripping things up and moving things around. So I'm going to read another excerpt. And I'm talking here about the crucifixion painting, which is the chapter in my book. Bacon strips away any sense of spiritual redemption or salvation, making it a subversive piece that embodies the dehumanizing violence and the brutal realities of human suffering during the war. But it's more than an exploration of personal and collective trauma. Bacon's investigations into pain and suffering remain strikingly relevant today. The painting's universal themes of suffering and psychological depth transcend historical context, speaking to us as we continue to grapple with alienation, identity, trauma, conflict, and the fragility of life. Francis Bacon had painted that painting just during World War II. It was put on show just after the end of World War II. And in those days, when people came to a gallery, they came in their tuxedos. Women came with their jewelry and their long dresses. they had to climb over the rubble. They had to climb over the rubble of London. Also, what's being released in the UK at this time while he's painting this? The images coming from Auschwitz. So when people say to me, why do you talk about the history of the artists? Why do you talk about their lives? It's because how can we not be affected by what's going on in the world? And I think that painting, that particular painting, the crucifixion, speaks to us of war now. It will still continue to speak to us about war. This is Amrita Shergill, as you know her. This is an artist I'm looking at the moment. And how do I talk about her to a Western audience, for example? As you probably know a lot about her. She was born in Budapest in 1913. She's the daughter of a Sikh aristocrat and a Hungarian opera singer. And so I'm looking at her at the moment as a bridge across Western and Indian art. And that's how I'm looking at her. And the only reason I'm saying this is because there are so many different ways you can look at these artists. Can you look at her as a young painter, when she was influenced by Gauguin? So that's another thing I'm looking at. She was very much influenced by Gauguin and also Cézanne as well. And another way of looking at her is the fact that she had this incredibly tragic life. And does that work reflect that? But it certainly does reflect the attitude towards women in this period in history. And that's what I'm looking at with her. Claude Monet, again, chocolate box artist. I think he's the most radical artist of all. I like to look at the Impressionists. I'm going to make this nice and I love thinking in this way. The Impressionists, how did the Impressionist movement come about? Claude Monet, of course, is the father of Impressionists. I think there are three factors. I think factor one is the Franco-Prussian War, which is on the left-hand side. Franco-Prussian War was 1870 to 1871. So many big art movements come from anguish and come from pain, and they come from war. Think about Cubism and the First World War. Franco-Prussian War was 1 year only, and it was so violent, so aggressive. People like Monet saw his best friends killed in that war, saw them murdered in Paris. Are these artists going to paint pretty pictures anymore? They're angry, so life changes, and the Impressionist movement came out of that. The next thing is the invention of the camera, and we'll talk more about that in 1839. You're talking about the first Impressionist exhibitions are in the 1870s, and then the invention of portable oil paints. So when the Franco-Prussian War happened, Monet went to London and he studied J.M.W. Turner. And J.M.W. Turner we call the godfather of Impressionism. So he was the man who was, again, a huge radical, working class kid, made good. His dad was a barber, such an amazing guy. And later on, he became more and more experimental. And Claude Monet adored him. Claude Monet studied him, and he came up with his first painting, which is Impression Sunrise. And Impression Sunrise was shown in 1872 at the very first Impressionist show. An art critic walked in, I'm sure you know this, an art critic walked in and was laughing at the work. People were rioting in Paris. Well, people are always rioting in Paris. But people were rioting in Paris because the Impressionists were so shocking. They were so shocking, so new and so radical. They were painting things like trains. Nothing romantic. They were painting modern day objects. They were painting the Eiffel Tower. And then Claude Monet paints this, and a critic walks in and says, "Ugh, what's this work?" That's the right title for this work, because that's all it is. It's just an impression. It doesn't mean anything. And Claude Monet, when he read the review, said, "That's a great title for a group." And so he called himself the Impressionists. So he took that and ran with it. Next, photography is invented. Look at the picture on the left. That's an apple. Taking a picture of an apple, it's done. Why do you want to paint an apple anymore that looks like an apple? What's the point? What's the point of making this beautifully realistic apple? And so people start thinking of new ways of working, new ways of thinking. Everything is changing in France and changing in Europe. That's Renoir in the middle. Absolutely stunning. Beautiful. But more importantly, that's Cézanne. That's Cézanne. Cézanne was Monet's best friend. He's really started the Impressionist movement, but kind of moved on. in a way. Monet was very friendly, very, good looking, good with the ladies. Cézanne was very, very difficult. But this is a painting he did of apples and a quince. And he said the most famous expression in art, which is he picked up an apple and he said, "With this apple, I will astonish Paris." And he did. He astonished Paris. So this is Cézanne here. But why, people started thinking differently once the camera was invented. Portable oil paints. That meant you could paint outside. You could paint outside with paints, because what happened before, let's say John Singer Sargent, he would have sketched outside with his sketchbook, gone into his studio, and then he would have painted, because paint dries very, very quickly. So paint dries too quickly, and it was kept in animal skin. So you had these huge animal skins. So you're taking these massive things around with you. People couldn't do it. But when portable oil paints were invented, that means you could go outside, paint outside, what the French call en plein air. And that meant that the Impressionists could paint outside for the very first time, because their paint wouldn't dry. And that meant they could get the impression of the light. And light, there's one thing you want to think about with the Impressionists, is light. They understood how light works. It's why Monet is going to paint the cathedral in Saint-Rouen over 30 times at different times of the day, because they want to see how light works. And that simple invention by an American changed everything. So 3 things. This is Claude Monet's most famous. I want to stick on Claude Monet for the moment. I think I've still got time. My chapter on him is called The Sistine Chapel of Impressionism. This, of course, is the famous water lilies paintings he did between 1914 and 1926. Now, I love coincidences. I love coincidences in art because, sometimes these art movements wouldn't have happened. So Claude Monet was pretty much retiring. He was retiring by the time he came around to 1916. And he had cataracts. He had cataracts in 2 eyes. And he was a bit of a scaredy cat. But who wouldn't be in this period of history having cataract operations? And so he only had 1 done. So apparently he used to paint with 1 eye like this while he's doing. So this is his best friend. And this is his best friend is Georges Clemenceau. You wouldn't expect them to be best friends. Georges Clemenceau was the French prime minister during World War II. He's the one who's going to cause lots of problems by signing in Versailles. But anyway, he was also a very famous politician, very aggressive, very super aggressive, but he loved art. Claude Monet was, he was about to retire, and Clemenceau wanted him to do 1 more work, just 1 more work, he said, not realizing that was going to take 14 years. So he is going to create the Orangerie in Paris. I'm going to show you some pictures of that in a minute, but why did he do that? And how did he persuade Monet? Monet was kind of, by the way, Monet was one of the few artists in history who was very, very famous as a young man. He was one of the first people in the world to own a Rolls Royce. Okay, he was the first person in France to get a speeding ticket for driving 21 miles an hour in Giverny. So he was a very interesting man. And so they were both speed freaks. They both went up to 22 miles an hour one day. So they were best friends, but really unlikely best friends. Now, Georges Clemenceau was an art collector, very famous art collector, and he was best friends with Rodin. He was very good friends with Rodin. And Rodin did the sculpture of him on the right-hand side. That's by Rodin. Georges Clemenceau saw it and said, "Oh my God, that's the worst thing I've ever seen in my life." And he said, "I am Auguste Rodin, and he said, "I don't care who you are, destroy it. I look miserable, I look grumpy, I look really imperious." And Rodin refused. So the end of the story is that Clemenceau hated Rodin forever. Okay. Now Rodin, who was born the same year as Claude Monet, they were frenemies at best. They were born the same year, and Rodin, they were both very famous. Rodin, as he was coming to the end of his life, he decided to give all of his works to the city of Paris and make a museum dedicated to him. And that museum is going to become the Musée Rodin, which is in Paris to this day. So he made this museum, and for 1 minute in history, Rodin was the king and Monet was nothing, just for 1 minute in history. And so everyone loved Rodin because he gave all his work to the city and it became this incredibly important museum. And Georges Clemenceau said to Monet, I want you to paint one final work, which is a monument to the war dead, a monument to the war dead of the First World War. People don't even think about this. And Monet said, I'm retired. I have cataracts still. I'm too tired to do this. And he said, have you heard what Rodin has been doing? And he said, no, what's he been doing? Well, he's given his entire collection to the state. Have you not read the newspapers? Pulled out the newspapers with all the headlines in them. And Monet thought about it for about 3 seconds. And he said, okay, I'll do it as well. I'll build a monument to myself. So he does that. He lives a lot longer than Rodin, almost 30 years longer than him. So he builds his own monument to himself. The French are very good at building monuments to themselves, as Napoleon tells us. So this is the monument he built. You know this place. So this is the orangery where his last water lilies are. It took nearly 14 years. And these are huge, enormous, long pieces of works of art. I'm going to read you a second to final excerpt. Now, what most people don't think about is about Monet, is how he was affected by World War I. I'm going to talk to you about the relatives he had in World War I. And he's in Giverny in the north of France while he's painting this, and he can hear the bombs in the distance. You know, he can hear the cannons going off in the distance. And everything is radically changing. Monet was deeply affected by the grim realities of war. His stepson engaged in frontline combat, and his own son Michel enlisted in 1915. The paintings recall the haunting imagery of the landscape of the Western Front. Battlegrounds that seem to stretch endlessly with no beginning or end, and with no discernible horizon. Soldiers found themselves submerged in vast seas of mud, surrounded by surreal, waterlogged vistas that obliterated any sense of time and space. There is a clear sense of mourning in the paintings, with Monet's use of foreshortened, weeping willow trees that seem to sweep you up in your embrace. Since ancient Greece, the willow tree has been used as a symbol of mourning and grief in art due to its drooping branches, and was often planted in French series as a form of memorialization. That's something which I think people have almost forgotten about, that these were actually done for war. These were actually done as a memorial to war. And then, of course, you know, the saddest thing, I think this is really the saddest thing about the entire story, is Clemenceau was so dedicated to Monet. He adored Monet. And when the museum opened, go back here. When the museum opened here in 1927, Monet had died the year before it opened. And thank God he died the year before, because people hated it. People didn't like this at all. They thought it was old school, it was old fashioned. Clemenceau was heartbroken, and he died heartbroken as well, because critics hated it. They thought it was over. The Impressionists were something else. Modernism had already come in by this point. And everyone forgot about this. And the interesting thing is that building was designed by Monet and an architect. He designed the building himself. And what's so interesting is that for 2 decades, they covered up his paintings with other people's paintings, and it became an exhibition center. At one point, for 1.5 years, it became a dog show. So with these paintings covered up until the 1950s. And that's when artists like Jackson Pollock, by the way, that's Monet at the top. Look how radical that painting is. He really could hardly see by this point. Jackson Pollock and all those people like Rothko, they had come to Paris and they discovered Monet. And it changed everything. Now to this day, it's the second most visited museum in Paris. Thank you. And then we can also look at it as prototype art that we're going to see by Yayoi Kusama, installation art as well, because it surrounds you. You feel like you're surrounded by it. I look at 8 women in my book. So we have Gentileschi, Vigée Lebrun, Hilma af Klint, Suzanne Valadon, Georgia O'Keeffe, then we have Frida Kahlo, we have Faith Ringgold, and then we have Yayoi Kusama. So it's really important to me that I looked at the history of women in art as well. I'm going to briefly, I'm going to close up soon. I want to talk about Yayoi Kusama because she's a chapter in my book. She's still working now. She's in her 90s. She came to New York when she was very young. She sewed money into her kimonos because it was illegal to bring money into New York at the time, or so much money. And she wrote to Georgia O'Keeffe and said, I'm coming to New York. Can you help me? And Georgia O'Keeffe said yes. Super generous woman, helped her to meet all these people. Yayoi Kusama got to know everybody. She's very sociable. And she had these incredible shows. Guess what happened? No one came. Guess what else happened? No one wrote about them. No one was interested in her. A woman in the early 1960s. It was very, very rare for an artist, particularly modern artists, to do this work. Look at that show at the bottom there, Accumulation. That work is very radical. Those are kind of penises made out of stuffed soft material, making a chair impossible to sit in, from 1962. Imagine the shock in those days. Look at the one above it, 1,000 boat shows. She covered the entire gallery in wallpaper of images of her own work. It was a radical show. No one came. No one was interested. No one wrote about her at all. So she struggled. But her work got seen in a different way by people ripping her off. And that is someone like Andy Warhol. 6 months after her show closed, he also had a show where he covered the entire gallery in wallpaper of his work. His show was a huge success, sold out everything. Klaus Oldenburg at the bottom, he had always worked with aluminium, hard materials. Suddenly he's working with this soft material, this soft stuffed material, the same as her. His work sells out, he becomes a huge success. So of course she's not seen at all. We all know Yayoi Kusama. I believe there's one in Mumbai, an infinity room by her. We all know her work. This is how we know her today. A lot to do with Instagram as well. And these are her infinity rooms. She did this infinity room. One critic wrote about her. Happened to be her boyfriend. So one critic wrote about her. She wasn't seen. What happens? 1 year later, Lucas Samaras has exactly the same idea. Miraculously. Do you know the interesting thing about Yayoi Kusama is she doesn't give a damn. Her autobiography, she actually says, they ripped me off. It's very unusual for artists to say something like that. And they did. They ripped her off. Now, I want to finish. I've got 4 minutes. I can do this in maybe 6. Okay, so this is my favorite work of art of all time. I'm an atheist, okay, and I love, not this work, the one I'm going to show you next. And I want to talk to you about how this work is seen. So this is La Pietà. This is, we're going to be talking about this work in a minute, okay, by Michelangelo. It's my favorite work of art of all time. So this is a work of art which is really interesting because only 100 years before he does this work, the Germans are doing it. They call it a Vesperbild, and it is the subject of Jesus dying in his mother's arms, okay? That subject is not in the Bible. That's interesting enough on its own because you only did religious paintings of subjects which are in the Bible. This is not in any of the 4 Gospels, Jesus dying in his mother's arms. Radical already in Germany. Vesperbild. And how do you portray a woman holding a fully grown man on her lap, like you do here? He's very, very stiff. The whole thing is stiff. There's no real emotion here as well. You have to do it by someone supporting them. John the Evangelist on the left-hand side, Mary Magdalene on the right-hand side. They're kind of propping him up because she can't manage him. He's too big, you know. Then 10 years after that painting by Perugino, along comes this guy, 23, 24 years old, between 23 and 24 years old. He creates this incredible masterwork. It really is the masterwork. This is a chapter in my book as well. And how does he do it? How does he make that look? You can see how different, right? Everyone can see how different those 2 images are. How does he make it look so beautiful? He does it by cheating. This is the Renaissance. This is the period when people are not, it's not just about art, it's about science. These people understand science. They're studying scholars from Muslim culture from 1,000 years before. These artists are all studying these great artists these great scientists, and they understood how the eye works. This is the shape you're going to get in Renaissance art again and again, which is the triangular shape. It pulls us up. Think about the Mona Lisa. It pulls us into her face. It's pulling us up all the time. That's what this image is doing. It's pulling us up into the Virgin Mary's face. But he's tricking us, because if the Virgin Mary stood up, she would be over 7 feet tall. And Jesus would be under 6 foot tall. But that's a trick. But once you know it, have a look at it now. And do you see it differently? She's big. She's a big woman. And what else does he do? He does something. How does she support him? By spreading her legs and supporting him in her legs. Now, guys, no artist would ever show the Virgin Mary with her legs like that. It's just not done. So he covers it up with this voluminous material. And so that's how he does it. He tricks our eyes. Look at the Virgin Mary. Does she look old enough to have a 33-year-old son? No. And he didn't care. The critics attacked him for that. He said she represents purity. That's why she's young. So it's all symbolic. Look at her hands when she's holding Jesus Christ. She's holding cloth. She's not touching his body. He's a holy body. This is when we move. This is when we move from a saint holding a dying son to a mother holding a dying son. This is why I love this painting. It's about motherhood as well. Look at this, the most beautiful touch. The way his arm flops down. He's going to do this with David as well. The vein is exactly as it would have happened. How our veins work. Those veins are going in exactly the position they would be in if you were holding your hand down. You can see the marks of the crucifixion. And look at this is the last thing I'll say. This touch of Jesus grasping onto his mother's cloth for the very last time. That's the last time he's going to hold his mother as he's dying. And to me, that represents everything about art and not necessarily about religion. I'm going to read one final excerpt and then I'm going to take questions. Sorry if I've run over. So by the way, he's 23, 24 when he does this. And if we go back here, you can see this. You can see the sash across her chest. It's the only sculpture he signed. Most sculptors didn't sign their work. It's the only one he signed, and that's because he heard a story. Someone went to see it and said, it's impossible. This work is actually impossible. There's no way a 22, 23-year-old could have done this. So he sneaks back in at night and he signs Michelangelo across her sash. So that's why it's his only signed one. It was his first work that catapulted him to the forefront of the great Renaissance artists, a work that masterfully combines technical brilliance with deep emotional and spiritual resonance, a work that seems almost uncanny for a 24-year-old. The young Michelangelo turned a religious subject into a moment of human experience, the sorrow of a mother mourning her son. The intimate portrayal of Mary cradling the body of Christ conveys a deeply personal moment of loss, which transcends religious context to resonate with anyone who has experienced grief or love. It is this universal emotional pull that makes the sculpture timeless. And I do believe that's what we're all trying to do, is make our mark. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. The first one is what you said at the end, the ability to make a mark. The ability to make a mark.
Yeah.
So what do you feel about street art and graffiti writers? In fact, many of the graffiti is also medieval and on works of art. In fact, some of the rock art also can be seen as graffiti. So what do you think about street art? That's one. The second question is
about Shiva.
Street art.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. And murals, like you have on the streets, which is open to the public, unlike the galleries, which are in some sense, or museums are in some sense, which are gated, right? Because they have fees or there is some other criteria. The second question is related to British colonialism, right? There's a lot of art in the British Museum, which is from all over the world. Now there's a huge movement, whether it's in Nigeria, whether it's India, to repatriate that art to to where it actually came from. So the people whose ancestors actually created that art can see them in the context it is. For example, in India, it is the Chola bronzes, which you might be aware of, right? They were kind of deified, but many of the Chola bronzes are in British and US museums. So these two questions: one about art outside the galleries, and the second one about the colonial history of art.
Yeah, well, the second one is very controversial. Thank you very much. So it's when I talk about it's all mark making. The thing about art that makes when you think about artists like Rothko, you think about this kind of art. This work is all about what makes work art, in my opinion, is time. And I think outsider artists and those kind of artists, once they're seen and once they're shown, the problem is that these days it's even worse and harder for those kind of artists to be seen. It's more difficult because those artists are blocked in a way. There aren't the public spaces anymore. I mean, this city, for example, is very wealthy. London is very wealthy. These cities, young artists can't afford to live in them. That's the problem. And I think people make their own mark, but I think it's how it's seen. And I think the problem is these days a lot of artists have to be marketing as well. They have to be able to market themselves. Don't know if that answers the question. British Museum, they should give the bloody work back. Seriously. You're talking to the wrong person. I'm probably hated by the British Museum, so they blocked me on Instagram. But the thing is, okay, this is the thing. Me growing up a poor kid in London, with no money at all. The British Museum is free. Our museums are free. And it was a space for us to go and see stuff. But I think in this day and age, things have changed, and we do. However, I do think the British Museum gets all the blame. Let's think about the Louvre, what's in the Louvre. Let's think about the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Most museums in the world have work taken from other cultures, but, the British Museum gets the main bulk of it. But yeah, I think just give the bloody stuff back, I say it all the time. So yes, that's my answer to that question. Controversial as well. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yep.
So I have a question. What's your take on Banksy's art?
Okay, so no, okay. So my business now is YouTube. The more views I get, the more money I make. I make money from advertising. If I did a video about Banksy, it would be incredibly popular. But I'm not going to do one. You know why? Because I'm not interested in Banksy. Okay, that's the honest truth. And I'm just a very blunt person, I'm afraid. I love some street art. I think Banksy to me is not the greatest street artist. That's the only issue with me. But I think a couple of things he's done, amazing. But when I write these scripts, I'm writing a script now on Amrita, and when I'm writing these scripts, I spend a long time with these people. I work 14-hour days with these people. I don't think I could spend 14 hours with Banksy. Sorry.
Wouldn't the same apply to Banksy? Someday we will come back and
Someday,
say,
yeah. There are artists like there are artists that I've covered on my channel, which I haven't been particular fans of, and I've grown to love them. So maybe that will happen with Banksy one day as well. So it has to have a punch for me. It has to appeal to me. I believe that I'm really passionate about art. People respond to that passion, and I'm not passionate about Banksy, I'm afraid. I know a lot of people are. Sorry. Yep.
So one of the things that I was speaking to somebody who was attending this show with you. So does your perception of the art change based on the history of the person who's painted it, or the artist per se, right? So if the artist has perhaps, we uncover that the artist has undergone some trauma or has done certain things while painting the painting, does it influence your perception in a negative way or a positive way? Positive way is what I have I've understood. Does it influence you in a negative way?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think yes is the answer to that, because I have maybe 6 or 7 unfinished projects, which I'm probably never going to do because I got bored doing them. The story didn't really interest me. And I think the story has to interest me. At the moment, I'm really very much interested in M.F. Hussein, and his story is so fantastic that it's changed my perception of his art, actually, about how I view his art. I think someone like Hieronymus Bosch, story of Hieronymus Bosch, we don't know. We don't know that story. But the story of what was happening in Europe at the time made me more interested in his work. So yes, I research a lot. So minimum 3 books I read. I'm always reading history books and art history books. And I sometimes just go, if I'm bored, then people are going to be bored watching this. So it has to hit me, It's like I'm not going to do stuff I don't want to do. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm happy doing stuff I want to do. And I think, yes, history changes how I look at someone. What's a good example? Perfect example, Monet. Knowing that those works are connected to the World War I, which most people don't understand. When I read that line in a history book, I was like, wow, this has changed my whole perception of that work. Now I see it as a completely different work of art. Doesn't mean I'm right, but that's how I see it. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the insightful lecture. I wanted to ask you, a lot of the artists that we celebrate now are not just controversial, they were downright inhumane. They were pedophiles and misogynists, like Picasso, like Dali, and we continue to celebrate them. And they get a free pass that there was a different time, but as we know very well, that we're still living in a time where the world is still ruled by pedophiles and misogynists. So at what time do we stop giving these artists, these powerful people, a free pass, and we shift the attention away from these artists towards the overlooked women, the women who didn't get the celebration that they deserved? And at what point do we say if art is a reflection of humanity, so we stop celebrating artists who are not in touch with their own humanity? Picasso, Dali, all of them abused underage girls. Why are we still celebrating them? Because they painted nice blocks, painted nice pictures. I think they should be left behind now.
No, I understand. And I never shy away from that stuff either. In my book, I talk about it in my Picasso section. I talk about that as well. I think one thing we have to think about is the age of consent in that period of history as well. But that doesn't make it right. I do think Picasso was a misogynist. He was a woman hater, and but he didn't do anything at the time which was illegal. So he didn't. I know legality and morality, but if you think about what was happening in the 17th, 18th century as well, it's a period of time. But I agree with you. Totally, we shouldn't be celebrating those characters. But I think also as well with someone like Picasso, for example, we should be talking about that. And I do talk about it in my book. In my chapter on Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, I talk about his attitudes towards women, and I talk about his problematic attitude to women as well. And I do think, I don't know about in India, but I do think women artists now are being much more celebrated in Europe. So I think somewhere like the Tate, for example, at the moment has 48% women and 52% men in the Tate gallery, so that is changing. And thank God, and I think, if you look at most art history books, my book has 30 chapters and 8 of them are on women, and 8 of them are on women like Artemisia Gentileschi. But then how do we look at those women? So, for example, Artemisia Gentileschi, she was raped by a friend of her father, but then do we always look at her as that's her story, that she was raped? Or do we also look at her as a great artist? That's the problem, is that these stories get overwhelmed. I struggle with YouTube. I struggle with YouTube because of censorship issues. Quite often, if I want to do modern women from the 20th century, there's a lot of sexual issues and I get censored and the videos get banned on YouTube, so it's still happening today. But I must say, that's the one thing which is really changing, at least in Europe. I don't know about in India. I didn't see many women artists in the National Gallery of Modern Art yesterday, for example. But in London, that's changing. But I 100% agree with you. We do need to look at these artists. I think Carl Andre, for example, has been cancelled. Carl Andre, who possibly, we don't know, killed his girlfriend. So he has been cancelled, so it does happen. But I think we have to look at history as well. And I do think history, by the way, even the word history is his story. It's one person's version of history. I agree with you, but I don't have that solution, I'm afraid. I wish I did. And my solution is to do things which most historians don't talk about. I talk about his misogyny. I talk about Picasso's misogyny, and I talk about Artemisia Gentileschi's rape issues. My book is a serious book. It's not a frivolous book. And so I deal with these issues up front. So thank you for the question. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. I had a question on how language prefacing art that you showcased at the start itself, and I'm a lawyer by training, and I see that I don't think it's exclusive to just artists. Tough, obtuse language, trying to sort of signal some sort of technical understanding or competence. But why do you think it prevails? Because art is meant to connect with the public, and wouldn't artists naturally want to do away with that already?
So the question is about language and artists. So, yep. Is that correct?
That's correct. That
Yep.
language prefacing art tends to become very, very obtuse.
Yeah, I do think language is used as a barrier. I honestly do. I think when you go into galleries in London, well, actually, I'm going to be totally upfront here. I think the text in the Museum of Modern Art here was so obtuse. I just thought I didn't know what they were talking about at points. And I thought, let the art stand for itself, or be direct, say what this is. I think the issue with language is I love language. That's why I started a books channel. I love language, but I do think that it can be used as a barrier, as a way of stopping people looking at art in a different way. I think, do we need lots of text on the wall? Not really, but I think a couple of lines might help. The thing is, I was asked recently to do something in the National Gallery in London, which was to do text on walls for young people. And I was like, young people don't give a damn about text on walls. They're on their phones, they scan barcodes. They read about stuff themselves. They know what they're doing. So, people always say to me, oh, let's make art more popular. No, galleries are really full. They're too crowded. Let's take art to people who don't have it. That's my idea, So when I talk about this kid in Mysore or this kid in Wisconsin, this kid in Ipswich in England, people who don't have access to museums, that's when I'm talking about the language can be a barrier to those people, I believe my videos open up that I'd say the most common thing I get on my channel is I've never been into art history, but now I love it, and I think that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make art history popular, and I think language can be can stop you. Is that okay?
Hi, I hope it's okay that I just wanted to share a comment rather than a question.
Yeah, sure.
So I studied art history at uni, and since then my life has taken a different direction. But I really enjoyed this whole experience because you remind me a lot of my first art history professor. And I was not intending to study art history when I got to uni, but I took one of his classes, and he just had the same way of engaging me, who was someone from a completely different culture and place, in the old masters at that time. That was the course that he did. And I felt like I could connect with it, which is what I think you were able to do as well. So thank you so much for kind of bringing me back into that space for a little while.
Thank you.
And thanks also for doing that for a lot of other people on YouTube and with the book.
Thank you. I met someone in Mumbai who's now studying art history because of my channel, and I was like, this is the best thing I've ever happened to me in my life, And this is someone who hated school.
Hi, James. Thank you
Hi.
for this wonderful session. I'm Raksha. My question to you is, what do you feel about taking away the art from the artist? I know you answered it in a different context, but I ask this because, when you go and look at a painting without the baggage of knowing the history of the artist, you can feel a different connection. Why does somebody cry in front of a Rothko painting? Is it because they know about what Rothko was thinking while making it, or they see something of themselves in the painting, right? And do you think that's also one of the reasons why maybe the artist didn't sign the Renaissance painting in that era? Is that to do with keeping it away from there?
Why didn't artists sign? Is that one of your questions, right? During the Renaissance era, because guys, we have to remember Michelangelo was paid. He did stuff for money. That's why he did it. He didn't do it for laugh. Leonardo da Vinci, when he did the Mona Lisa, he's paid to do it. So these guys are being paid. People didn't sign it. It just wasn't the standard. It was unusual to sign. The 20th century changed everything. That's when artists started to say, oh, I quite like to paint this. No one did that before. Canvas is expensive. Oil paint is expensive. People are in it for the money. They might be geniuses. They might be great artists. Raffaello might be the best artist in the world, in my opinion. However, he was doing it for the money, But in the back of his head is a genius. Now, that's where it works, In the back of his head, there's a genius. Paint, paint, paint. So that's how they're working. But, another question I think was about, do we need all this description and telling, right? Well, this is a good example. Because I grew up in London and all museums are free. Okay, so I could afford to go to museums all the time. If you've been to London, it rains a lot. A lot. So we spent a lot of time in museums keeping out of the rain. Okay, so that's how it absorbed into me by osmosis. When I was 15 years old, in my school uniform, we were taken to see J.M.W. Turner because he's the king. He's the king. Oh my God. Yeah, he is. He's a genius. Okay. And on the way to this gallery with my school, I walked past the Rothko room, Mark Rothko. And I'm like, ugh, what's all this crap? It's like just big blotches of paint, And I walked past, and then we're given free time. We're all kind of running to the shop to buy our stuff, And I was given free time. And I went back to the Rothko rooms, and there was a guide, a woman in her 60s, talking to a group of 6 or 7 people about Mark Rothko. And I was hooked. Bish, bash, bosh. I was hooked because she was so amazing. She was telling this great story. And I started to see Rothko through Rothko the man rather than just the work, And I think sometimes we do need some explanation. And sometimes we don't need any. I need a lot. I like explanation. Yep. Oh, sorry. Oh.
Hello.
Hi.
So, a little bit different question. So, you expand on how the history influences an artist and how that can enhance the painting. What I wanted to ask was, have you ever interacted with a living artist, perhaps, and tried to interview them, get to understand what they're actually feeling rather than us? I love your history, which comes along with your explanation, and that really expands my understanding of the paintings. And thank you so much for that, for making it accessible for all of us. But have you ever worked with someone who is a living artist?
Yeah, well, I have lots of jobs. So I also work as an art critic as well. And so I interview artists a lot as well. And then, of course, I had a gallery. So my gallery had a woman who was, we had a huge amount of female artists in my gallery. I have a female business partner. It doesn't exist anymore. The London rents killed me. But anyway, so I had a woman who was 78 years old. And I had I nearly said boy, but 22 is a boy to me. Straight out of art school. We signed him up out of art school, for our gallery. So we did deal with lots of younger artists. And the thing is like, I don't know whether this is slightly contentious, but, if you think about some of the greatest books in the world, are those books really about what the author thinks they're about? Or are they about something else? Is Jackson Pollock's work really about accidents? Or is it about something else? So I think that's why I offer interpretations. I never, ever, ever, ever say I'm right, because I know I'm really often wrong, But I offer ideas for people to answer the question.
Hi, James. Hi.
Oh, hello.
Just taking a little cue on the gentleman who said that he used the word living. I just had the question: who are not living? Like, who's your favorite artist whom you would have really liked to take out for a dinner or lunch and really talk your heart out and get the insight of, as you rightly said, the interpretation, not an interpretation, but what would you have liked to have a conversation like?
Yeah. Who would I like to have dinner with? There's too many. It'd be a big dinner party, but I'd say Turner for sure. Just because I wanted to tell him he was right. That's it. You were right, Mr. Turner. So I kind of want to. And he was a rambunctious, annoying person. I think he'd be great at a dinner party, drinking loads, getting off his head. I think I'd love to. I'd love to have met Artemisia Gentileschi because I find her so kind of powerful and interesting. Frida Kahlo, no, not so much. Georgia O'Keeffe, yes. Georgia O'Keeffe, I'd love to sit down with her. And most of the artists I'd love to sit down with dinner artists, I have questions. I'd love to, can you imagine having dinner with Van Gogh and saying, look what's happened?
Thanks, James. Great session. It was very emotional for me because I've seen a lot of this art you talked about. I was in Rome December looking at Pietà. I have the Lovers by Magritte in my home print. This session makes me want to feel like go back and experience some of this, and it also makes me feel that why don't we have, unfortunately, this access in India where we could go to a gallery or a museum? What could, I don't know, what could we do to make it more accessible, not in just digital form, right? Because that's still secondary, right? What the feeling you get when you actually stand in front of a sculpture or a painting is so different than watching it on a YouTube video.
That can't be replicated. Now, I think I'm giving you the second best, maybe, which is taking art out to the people somehow or other. But I think that can't be replicated. You will never understand Rothko until you stand in front of him, ever. You won't get it. What can you do? I had lunch yesterday with the man who runs the History of Bangalore podcast, which I'm going to be appearing on, and because I'm obsessed with Bangalore now, by the way, and he was saying, we were talking about why the art we see in India, is so, it's not so accessible art-wise, but that's because possibly, in my opinion, and his opinion, that it's more of a literature culture. It actually comes from the literature from India is known all over the world. It's kind of, whereas Indian artists, which I'm looking at, I looked at Ilya Repin, a Ukrainian artist or Russian artist, depends on who's saying it. And I looked at him, as a work of, almost all my viewers had never heard of him, and I can tell you that they would not have heard of M.F. Hussein. They won't have heard of him, but I don't care. I feel it's my job to take those out to people and to see them in a different way. I was so upset though yesterday going to the Museum of Modern Art, none by him. None, not one. I'm like, where is he? Where's his work being seen? So anyway, I need to come back to India and look at some more work. So, but I've been to the Elephanta Caves, for example, on this trip. I've been to Mysore. I've been here for 3 weeks. This is a holiday. I'm on holiday, and I went to the Elephanta Caves. Holy cow! It's like that's just blew me away. It's just, and that's maybe something I might want to make a film about as well. So it's different culture. Very, very.
Thank you, James, for a fantastic talk and for a fantastic YouTube channel as well. My question is more so from, I want your opinion as an art critic and someone who studied art history and is very, very familiar with different forms of art. Great art that has previously come about has always come about from a place of patronage and access, right?
Yeah.
Artists were, there were politicians or other famous people and people in power who were patrons to a particular artist, would give them money, and then they would create works of art. When you look at the modern context and when you look at art in the modern context, the patronage has sort of shifted from the upper class, or as you would call them, the aristocracy or like the elite, down to the working class or the middle class, and where we are expected to sort of be patrons of artists that we like in order for them to be able to succeed. In your opinion, as an art critic, do you see it sort of playing out differently in the modern context, where is there a way for us to bring back great art, or
get great artists to the forefront through patronage that maybe exists outside of these two models, or is there a different way of probably looking at this?
Great question, and really complicated question. So it's there are this is really my opinion. So I'm starting a podcast, by the way, which starts in February on Spotify, and we're doing a podcast about class, about how the world has changed, the art world has changed because of class, because of access to it. So let's say a kid like me, my background, they couldn't afford to live in London, they couldn't afford to go to college, because we pay for college now. I think you guys pay for college, right? Yeah. So it's expensive. Everything's expensive. So and so the access to those gates are not there, So, and the problem is, if you go to a fancy I went to a fancy museum in Mumbai, very fancy. Art gallery. And all of the people who worked there were very posh, It's like there's no working class kids working in it. So access is now governed by a very small amount of people. So them telling who the great artist is governed by a very small amount of people. And unfortunately for India, most of them are Europeans as well, So it's the Europeans telling me what to think. And the problem is I listen, So it's like, how do you get over that? And I think what has really changed in the world is that now, when I grew up, I went around friends' houses. No one had art on their walls. Now everyone has art on their walls. You can get posters cheaply. You can actually buy art from people. I have a problem with saying that artists can just create work, because art should be a living. Art should be a job as well. There's nothing. When I used to have these artists working for me in the gallery, and I'd say, "We sold all of your work," they go, "Oh, thank you. I'm giving you a check for this amount of money." Artists need to think about money, because if you have money, you can live, and that's the issue. That is the big issue. So do I think it's getting better? No, sorry. I really wish it was. I think access to the arts is closing up tighter and tighter, and it's being run by a very few people. I'm sure even in India, I don't know. To answer the question. Kind of. Okay. And thank you so much. And thank you very much. Unbelievable. Thank you.